In a crumbling Italian seaside town, a grieving American woman was about to make the most dangerous 20-cent purchase of her life. What started as an impulsive bid at a dusty auction took a shocking turn when she came face to face with centuries of hidden secrets painted on forgotten walls. Marjorie Wells wasn't your typical tourist. For 10 years, she had spent her life restoring masterpieces in climate-controlled New York studios, known for her ability to see beauty beneath layers of damage and time. But her father's sudden death had left her with nothing but debts and unanswered questions about his past. When she encountered the Basilica di San Sebastiano, crumbling in Gothic shadows, she had no idea she was walking into a web of wartime secrets, Nazi treasure hunters and modern art thieves. Marjorie raised her paddle that would lead to the discovery of Francesco di Marco's lost masterpieces and a deadly game with collectors who killed for far less than $400 million. What began as an escape from grief would become a fight for survival. The small Italian town would never be the same after she uncovered not just Renaissance frescoes, but evidence that her father had helped complete them during World War II, connecting her family to a legacy of resistance that spanned centuries. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The auction hall smelled like dust and desperation. 23 people scattered across folding chairs that could have seated 200, most of them locals, clutching numbered paddles like they might need to defend themselves. I sat in the back row, my coffee gone cold, watching Giovanni Russo work through a list of properties that nobody wanted. "Lot 47, Russo called out, his voice echoing off empty walls. The Basilica di San Sebastiano, approximately 800 square meters, stone construction circa 15th century. He paused, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the October chill seeping through broken windows. Current condition is compromised. No utilities, significant structural concerns. Minimum bid €1, the Basilica. I'd driven past it 3 times since arriving in town, each time slowing down to stare at its weathered stone walls, rising from a tangle of wild grass and broken columns. It looked like something from a Gothic novel, all shadows and crumbling grandeur, the kind of place that whispered stories if you knew how to listen. "Any bids?" Russo's eyes swept the room with the tired efficiency of a man who'd been doing this too long. €1 for a piece of history, ladies and gentlemen. Silence stretched between us like a held breath. The old woman in front of me clutched her purse tighter. The man to my left studied his shoes. Even the teenagers near the door seemed to shrink back from the auctioneer's gaze. 50 cents, then. Russo's voice cracked slightly. Surely someone... My hand went up. I hadn't planned it. Hadn't even realized I was moving until I saw Russo's face brighten with relief that bordered on gratitude. 50 cents. Thank you, madam. Any other bids? The silence felt heavier now, loaded with something I couldn't identify. A few heads turned my way, but the expressions weren't curious. They were pitying, like I'd just volunteered to adopt a rabid dog. 20 cents, I said, surprising myself again. I'll bid 20 cents. Russo blinked. I'm sorry. You're asking for bids. I'm bidding 20 cents. The words came out stronger than I felt. But grief had taught me that sometimes you had to commit to your mistakes before you understood them. The room erupted in low murmurs and chuckles. Someone behind me whispered something in rapid Italian that made others laugh. But Russo wasn't laughing. He was staring at me like I'd just solved a problem he'd been carrying for years. 20 cents, he said, his voice suddenly firm. Do I hear any other bids? No? Going once, going twice. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. Sold to the American lady for 20 cents. The laughter died away. In the sudden quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat and the scratch of Russo's pen on paper. He was already filling out the deed, his handwriting quick and determined, like he was afraid I might change my mind. 20 minutes later, I walked out of that dusty hall holding legal ownership of an 800-year-old basilica. The deed felt heavier than it should have. the paper warm from Rousseau's sweating palms. He'd practically shoved it into my hands, along with a set of keys that looked older than democracy. "Congratulations, Signora Wells," he'd said, but his smile never reached his eyes. "I hope you'll be very happy with your purchase." Now I stood outside the auction hall, studying the basilica across the narrow street. Up close, it was even more imposing than it had seemed from my car. The main structure rose 30 feet above the cobblestones, its stone walls patched with centuries of weather and wear. Gothic arches lined the sides like empty eye sockets, and the bell tower leaned slightly southward, as if the whole building was tired of standing upright. Most people would call 20 cents a bargain. My father would have called it the kind of impulse that got people into trouble they couldn't afford. But Dad was 3 months dead, buried in Queens next to Mom, and his art restoration business had collapsed. Along with my inheritance and everything else I'd thought was solid in my life, I'd come to Italy to escape the whispers of creditors and the weight of his empty workshop. I'd expected to find peace in museums and gelato, maybe some clarity about what came next. I hadn't expected to become the owner of a crumbling monument to someone else's faith. The basilica's main door stood slightly ajar, hanging on hinges that had given up their grip decades ago. Beyond the threshold, I could see only darkness and the suggestion of vast space. The October wind picked up, rattling loose stones and carrying the scent of old prayers and older secrets. I tucked the deed into my jacket pocket and walked toward my 20-cent cathedral, keys jingling like wind chimes in my hand. Behind me, I heard Rousseau's car engine start up and drive away too quickly, as if he was afraid I might ask for my money back. The door creaked open at my touch, revealing a vast, hollow space that seemed to swallow the afternoon light. My footsteps echoed on broken stone tiles, each sound returning to me distorted and strange, like voices speaking in a language I'd almost forgotten. The nave stretched before me, longer than it had seemed possible from outside. Massive columns reached toward a vaulted ceiling lost in shadow, their capitals carved with faces that time had worn smooth but not peaceful. Between them, dust motes danced in shafts of light that fell through gaps where stained glass had once blazed with color. It was beautiful in the way that ruins are beautiful, not despite the decay, but because of it. The basilica had been stripped of its ornaments, its pews, its altar, everything portable or valuable. What remained was the skeleton of faith itself, the bones of 8 centuries of prayer and hope and human struggle against mortality. I walked deeper into the nave, my footsteps marking time like a metronome. The acoustics were perfect. Even my breathing seemed to resonate in harmonies with itself. Someone had designed this space to amplify the human voice, to make every whispered confession and shouted hallelujah echo back with divine authority. Near what had been the altar, I stopped. The raised platform was still intact, though cracked marble showed where communion rails and ceremonial fixtures had been removed. But it was the wall behind the altar that made me catch my breath. Frescoes, faint, damaged, obscured by centuries of candle smoke and neglect, but definitely frescoes. My art restorer's eye picked out the ghost images beneath layers of grime. Robes that might once have been crimson and gold, faces that still held suggestions of expression, hands raised in gestures of blessing or supplication. I moved closer, pulling out my phone's flashlight to examine the wall more carefully. The beam revealed details that daylight had hidden, subtle variations in texture that suggested different painting techniques, areas where the plaster had been deliberately scraped away, and underneath it all, the unmistakable signs of work that had been covered rather than destroyed. These weren't just any frescoes. Even damaged and dirty, I could see the quality of the original work. The proportions were too confident, the composition too sophisticated for provincial church art. Someone with serious training had painted these walls, someone who understood light and shadow and human anatomy in ways that took decades to master. I pressed my palm against the wall, feeling the cool roughness of aged plaster. Beneath my touch, I imagined I could sense the layers of history, the original Renaissance paintings, the later attempts to preserve or hide them, the modern abandonment that had left them to fade in darkness. The basilica itself seemed to press closer around me, as if it were curious about this stranger who'd paid 20 cents to become its keeper. The shadows between the columns shifted slightly, though there was no wind inside to move them. The dust motes swirled in patterns that looked almost purposeful, like they were writing messages in languages older than Italian. I'd spent 10 years restoring art in climate-controlled studios, working with insurance forms and conservation protocols, and clients who measured beauty in market value. But standing in this echoing space, surrounded by mysteries painted in pigments ground from lapis lazuli and gold leaf, I felt something I hadn't experienced since art school, the pure desire to uncover what had been hidden, to bring back to light what someone had taken pains to preserve in darkness. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister back in New York. "How's the vacation? Found any good museums?" I almost laughed. Instead, I took a photograph of the faded frescoes, though the flash barely penetrated the accumulated grime of centuries. This wasn't a vacation anymore. This was something else entirely, something that felt like purpose. I had no idea what I'd stumbled into, but I knew enough about hidden art to recognize that these walls held secrets worth more than the 20 cents I'd paid for the building around them. As I turned to leave, something made me look back over my shoulder. The basilica felt different now, as if my presence had awakened something that had been dormant. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence more attentive. If buildings could hold memories, this one had been remembering for a very long time. I locked the door behind me and walked back to my rental car, but I could feel the basilica watching me go. Tomorrow, I decided, I'd come back with proper lights and tools. Tomorrow, I'd start uncovering what 8 centuries and 20 cents had just made mine to discover. I returned to the basilica at dawn, carrying a tackle box full of restoration tools I'd bought from the hardware store in the town square. The owner had looked puzzled when I'd asked for fine brushes and small scrapers, but he'd sold them to me along with a battery-powered LED work light that cast harsh white illumination over whatever it touched. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn rain, and the basilica looked different in the early light. Less mysterious, more fragile. In daylight, I could see how much damage weather and time had done to the stone walls, how many of the carved details had eroded beyond recognition. But I could also see possibilities that the shadows had hidden. I set up my light near the altar wall and examined the frescoes more systematically. What I'd glimpsed yesterday was just the beginning. Traces of painted figures extended across much of the wall, disappearing beneath layers of whitewash and grime that someone had applied deliberately. This wasn't natural decay. This was concealment. I started with a small section near the bottom of the wall, using a soft brush to remove surface dirt. The first few minutes revealed nothing but more dirt, but then I began to see color. A flash of deep blue, the kind that came from ground ultramarine, then gold leaf, still clinging to the plaster in tiny flakes that caught the LED light like scattered stars. An hour later, I'd uncovered a section of robe that took my breath away. The fabric seemed to flow across the wall with a naturalism that belonged in the Vatican, not in this abandoned provincial church. The painter had understood how cloth moved around the human body, how light revealed texture and weight. This was Renaissance work, the real thing, painted by someone who'd studied the masters, but there was something else, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Woven into the traditional religious imagery were symbols I didn't recognize, geometric patterns that seemed to shift when I looked at them directly, designs that belonged more in an illuminated manuscript than on a church wall. I was so absorbed in the work that I didn't hear the footsteps until they were right behind me. "You should not have come back." I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs. An old man stood in the nave, backlit by the morning sun streaming through the doorway. He was short and stocky, wearing work clothes that had seen decades of honest labor, and his weathered face held an expression of profound disappointment. "I'm sorry. I didn't hear you come in. The door has been broken for 20 years. His English was accented but precise, like he'd learned it from books rather than conversation. "I am Antonio Bellanti. People call me Nino. I take care of the ruins in this town. Marjorie Wells." I gestured toward the wall where I'd been working. "I bought this place yesterday. I'm just trying to see what... I know who you are." Nino stepped closer, and I could see the deep lines around his eyes, the way his hands were scarred from a lifetime of physical work. "The American woman who paid 20 cents for what no one else would touch. The whole town is talking about the crazy foreigner who bought the cursed basilica." Cursed? I tried to keep my voice light, but something in his tone made it difficult. "It's just an old building." Nino shook his head slowly. "Nothing is just anything in Italy, Signora Wells, especially not here, especially not this place." He moved closer to examine my work, and his expression grew troubled. "You are uncovering what was hidden for good reason." I looked at the section of fresco I'd revealed, suddenly seeing it through his eyes. "Someone painted over these deliberately, but why? They're beautiful. Beautiful, yes, but dangerous." Nino touched the wall gently, like he was greeting an old friend. "My grandfather helped hide what you are uncovering. During the war, when the Germans came, looking for treasures to steal, the people of this town made a choice. They covered the walls, sealed the chambers, pretended there was nothing here worth taking, sealed the chambers." I felt a flutter of excitement despite his serious tone. "There are more rooms?" "Signora," Nino's voice was gentle but firm, "there are some secrets that should stay buried. My grandfather died keeping the oath he made in 1943. He never spoke of what lies beneath this place, not even to his family. But he warned us, if anyone ever started uncovering the walls, we should tell them to stop." I studied his face, trying to read the conflict there. "But you're not trying to stop me." "Not really." A long silence stretched between us. Finally, Nino sighed and ran his hand along the wall where centuries of pilgrims had worn the stones smooth. "I'm an old man, and the world has changed. Perhaps the time for secrets has passed." He looked at me directly. "But if you continue this work, you must understand that others will come. Others who see value where they should see sanctity." "What kind of others?" "The kind who measure beauty in euros instead of prayers." His expression darkened. "Giovanni Russo has already made 3 phone calls since yesterday's auction. Word travels quickly when something valuable surfaces in a poor town." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "You think these frescoes are valuable?" "I think," Nino said carefully, "that my grandfather chose to die protecting secrets rather than let them fall into the wrong hands. And I think you should decide very carefully whether you wish to inherit his burden." He turned to leave, then stopped at the threshold. "If you continue, there is a woman at the university in Naples, Dr. Sofia Conti. She studies art history, specializes in work from this period. If anyone can tell you what you have found, it would be her." "Nino," I called after him. "Why are you helping me?" He paused without turning around. "Because my grandfather also said that someday the right person would come. Someone who would understand that some things are worth more than money." He looked back at me over his shoulder. "I hope he was right about you, Signora Wells." After he left, I stood alone in the basilica with my LED light casting harsh shadows on the uncovered fresco. The painted figure seemed to watch me with eyes that held secrets spanning centuries. I thought about Nino's warning, about the phone calls Giovanni Russo had already made, about the burden of inheriting mysteries I didn't understand. Then I picked up my brush and went back to work. Some discoveries, I was beginning to realize, chose their discoverers as much as the other way around. And whatever lay hidden beneath these walls had been waiting a long time for someone foolish enough or determined enough to bring it back to light. Dr. Sofia Conti arrived at the Basilica 3 days later, driving a small Fiat that wheezed to a stop beside the crumbling stone walls. I watched through the doorway as she emerged from the car, A woman in her 40s, with prematurely grey hair pulled back in a severe bun and clothes that suggested she'd dressed for a library. Not a construction site, Signora Wells. Her voice carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. I received your message about Renaissance frescoes. I must admit I was skeptical. Dr. Conti, thank you for coming. I gestured toward the wall, where I'd now uncovered nearly 2 square meters of painted surface. I think you'll find this worth the drive from Naples. She entered the basilica with the measured steps of an academic, but I saw her pace quicken as her eyes adjusted to the interior light. When she reached the wall where my LED work light illuminated the exposed frescoes, she stopped breathing entirely. "Madonna mia," she whispered, then immediately switched to rapid Italian that sounded like prayers and profanity mixed together. For 5 minutes, she stood motionless, studying the revealed paintings with an intensity that reminded me of my father, examining a piece he suspected might be more important than it appeared. Finally, she pulled out a magnifying glass and moved closer to examine the brushwork. "The technique is extraordinary," she said, her voice professionally controlled but tight with excitement. Late 15th century, possibly early 16th. The use of sfumato here, the way the light plays across the fabric, this is the work of someone who studied directly under the masters. I thought so too, but I wasn't sure. It seemed too sophisticated for a provincial church. Dr. Conti straightened, her expression suddenly guarded. "Where exactly did you say you found this?" "I bought the basilica at auction. These were hidden under layers of whitewash and grime." I pointed to the areas I hadn't yet touched. "There's evidence of more extensive work, possibly covering most of this wall. You bought it." She repeated the words like she was trying to make sense of a foreign language. "For how much?" 20 cents. Dr. Conti stared at me for a long moment, then began to laugh. Not the pleasant laugh of someone who'd heard something amusing, but the slightly hysterical laugh of an academic who'd just realized the universe had a sense of humor after all. 20 cents, she said again, for what might be one of the most significant Renaissance discoveries in decades. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I've spent 15 years writing grant proposals to fund excavations that turn up pottery shards, and you stumble into this by accident." It wasn't entirely by accident. "I'm a trained art restorer, or I was before." I stopped myself before mentioning Dad's business collapse. "I know enough to recognize quality work when I see it. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." "Now back to the story." She nodded, refocusing on the frescoes. "The symbols concern me, though. These geometric patterns, they're not typical ecclesiastical imagery." She traced one of the designs with her finger, careful not to touch the surface. "This looks almost like..." She trailed off, frowning. "Like what?" "There was a painter, worked in this region during the late 15th century, Francesco di Marco. He was known for incorporating esoteric symbols into religious works, supposedly encoding hidden meanings that only initiates could interpret." She glanced at me. "The church condemned his work as heretical. Most of his paintings were destroyed or lost." A chill ran down my spine. "You think these might be his work?" "I think," Dr. Conti said carefully, "that if these frescoes are authentic Francesco di Marco pieces, they would be worth somewhere between 50 and 200 million euros. The number hit me like a physical blow. I sat down heavily on a broken piece of masonry, trying to process what she'd just told me. "Of course," she continued, "proper authentication would require months of analysis, technical examination, provenance research, and even then, the legal questions would be complex. Who owns artwork discovered on private property? What about cultural patrimony laws? The Italian government takes a very dim view of valuable artifacts leaving the country. I don't want to sell them," I said quickly. "I just want to understand what I've found." Dr. Conti's expression softened slightly. "That's refreshing to hear. But you need to understand, Signora Wells, that a discovery of this magnitude cannot remain private. Word will spread, regardless of our intentions. And when it does, you will find yourself dealing with people whose interests are considerably less academic than mine. Nino mentioned that Giovanni Russo has been making phone calls. Ah, you've met our local guardian. A slight smile crossed her face. Nino is a good man, but he carries burdens that predate our lifetimes. His family has protected this place for generations, often at considerable personal cost. I thought about Nino's grandfather, dying to keep secrets rather than betray them to Nazi treasure hunters. What exactly happened here during the war? That's a conversation for another day, with better wine and more time. Dr. Conti pulled out her phone and began taking careful photographs of the exposed frescoes. For now, we need to decide how to proceed. I can help you document and authenticate what you found, but I need to know, are you prepared for the complications that will follow? I looked at the painted figures on the wall, their faces emerging from centuries of darkness, like people waking from long dreams. Somewhere beneath the remaining grime and whitewash were more secrets, more beauty, more questions that might lead to answers I wasn't sure I was ready to hear. I need to know what this place really is, I said finally. Whatever the cost, Dr. Conti nodded. Then we begin tomorrow. Bring more lights, and I'll bring proper documentation equipment. But Signora Wells, once we start this process, there will be no going back. Are you certain you're prepared for that? I thought about my father's workshop, empty now and locked behind a door I might never open again. I thought about the creditors who'd circled like vultures after his funeral, picking apart 40 years of careful work and passionate collecting. Most of all, I thought about the weight of inheriting secrets that might finally have found their way to the light. I'm prepared, I said, though I wasn't sure if I was lying. The next morning brought rain that drummed against the Basilica's broken roof and sent streams of water down the walls in patterns that looked almost intentional. Dr. Conti arrived early, carrying equipment cases and wearing the focused expression of someone who'd spent the night researching instead of sleeping. I made some calls, she announced, setting up a professional camera with multiple flash units. Discreetly, of course. But I found records that confirm Francesco di Marco did work in this region between 1485 and 1492. There are gaps in the historical record, periods when his location was unknown. What happened to him? He disappeared. Some accounts say he fled Italy ahead of Inquisition charges. Others suggest he was murdered by rivals who envied his royal patronage. She adjusted her camera settings. But there are local legends that claim he spent his final years working on a secret commission, something he called his testament to God and conscience. I thought about the symbols hidden in the frescoes, the way they seemed to shift when light hit them at different angles, a testament that the church didn't approve of. Precisely, Dr. Conti began photographing the exposed sections with systematic precision, which would explain why these walls were covered so carefully. Someone wanted to preserve the work without displaying it openly. The morning passed in careful documentation. We measured, photographed, and catalogued every visible detail of the revealed frescoes. But it was Nino's arrival at midday that shifted our focus from art history to local memory. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, he told me, rain dripping from his weathered coat. About inheriting burdens. There are things you should know if you truly intend to uncover what lies here. Dr. Conti looked up from her camera. Nino, perhaps you could tell us about your grandfather's involvement during the war. The old caretaker was quiet for so long, I thought he might refuse to answer. Finally, he walked to the wall where we'd been working and placed his hand on a section still covered in whitewash. My grandfather was 19 when the Germans came. He worked for the parish then, helping the priest with maintenance, repairs, cleaning. In the summer of 1943, word came that Wehrmacht art specialists were moving through the region, cataloguing treasures for safekeeping in the fatherland. The Nazis were systematically looting Italian art collections, Dr. Conti explained, particularly religious works from smaller institutions that couldn't protect themselves. Nino nodded. The priest, Father Benedetto, knew what was hidden here. His predecessor had shown him, sworn him to secrecy, passed down the responsibility like a family curse. When the German trucks appeared on the horizon, Father Benedetto made a choice. He covered the frescoes. I said, more than that. Nino moved to a section of wall that looked slightly different from the rest, where the stones seemed newer, the mortar cleaner. They sealed chambers, moved artifacts, created false walls to hide what could not be moved. My grandfather and 6 other men worked for 3 nights, using ancient passages that connected the basilica to buildings throughout the town. Ancient passages? Dr. Conti's voice sharpened with professional interest. The basilica was built on Roman foundations. Over the centuries, the townspeople expanded the underground network for storage, for safety during raids, for smuggling when times were hard. Nino pressed against the newer section of wall, and I heard a hollow sound that suggested empty space beyond. When the Germans arrived, they found an empty church with some minor religious decorations. Nothing worth the fuel to transport back to Germany, but the real treasures remained hidden, I said, until now. Nino's expression was troubled. My grandfather died in 1987. On his deathbed, he made me promise to watch over this place, to ensure that if anyone ever started uncovering what was hidden, they would understand the weight of what they carried. Dr. Conti had stopped photographing and was studying the wall section Nino had indicated. There's definitely something behind here. The acoustic properties are completely different. She looked at me. If we remove just a few stones... No, Nino said sharply. Not yet. There are protocols to follow, permissions to obtain, and there are dangers you do not understand. What kind of dangers? Nino walked to the doorway and looked out at the rain-soaked town beyond. Giovanni Russo received a phone call yesterday. From London. A private collector who somehow learned about your discovery. I felt my stomach drop. How could anyone in London know what we found? Word travels quickly in the art world, Dr. Conti said grimly. Especially when significant sums of money are involved. This collector, he has a reputation, Nino continued. Victor Hale. He specializes in acquiring important pieces that museums cannot afford or governments will not sell. His methods are comprehensive. Meaning? Meaning, Dr. Conti answered, that Victor Hale doesn't accept no as an answer. If he's interested in what you found, he'll find a way to make it his. I looked at the frescoes we'd uncovered, at the hints of greater treasures hidden behind the remaining walls, at the ancient stones that had kept secrets since before America existed. In 3 days, I'd gone from owning nothing but debt and grief to sitting on a discovery that might rewrite art history. But with that potential came dangers I was only beginning to understand. There's something else, Nino said quietly. In my grandfather's papers, there were names of people who helped hide the art, people who risked their lives to preserve beauty instead of wealth. He looked directly at me. One of those names was Wells, an American soldier named Thomas Wells, who helped coordinate the hiding operation. The world tilted around me. Thomas Wells, you know this name? I sat down hard on the broken masonry, my hands shaking. Thomas Wells was my father's name. He served in Italy during World War II, but he never talked about it. Never said a word about what he did here. The rain continued to fall through the broken roof, but inside the basilica, silence stretched between us like a held breath. 3 generations of secrets had just collided in the space of a heartbeat. And I finally understood why purchasing this place for 20 cents had felt less like impulse and more like coming home. Victor Hale stepped out of a black Mercedes that looked expensive enough to buy half the town. Even from inside the basilica, I could see the way he carried himself, like a man who had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved with the right combination of money and pressure. Trouble, Dr. Conti muttered, lowering her camera. We'd been working for 6 days now, carefully documenting everything we'd uncovered while debating whether to break through the wall, section that Nino insisted concealed. Additional chambers. Hale walked toward the basilica with the confident, stride of someone surveying property he intended to own. He was perhaps 60, silver-haired and immaculately dressed, despite the muddy cobblestones and morning drizzle. Two younger men followed at a respectful distance, assistants, bodyguards, or both. Signora Wells, I presume. His accent carried traces of British boarding school education, polished by years of international business. I am Victor Hale. I believe we have matters of mutual interest to discuss. I don't think we do. I continued cleaning grime from a section of fresco, not bothering to look up from my work. Hale's laugh was warm and practiced. I think you'll find we do indeed, may I? He gestured toward the wall where our LED lights illuminated the revealed paintings. This is private property, of course. And what magnificent property it is. He moved closer to examine the frescoes, his expression shifting from polite interest to focused intensity. Francesco di Marco, remarkable condition considering the age. I'm particularly intrigued by the symbolic elements. The church banned his work for good reason, too much truth hidden in beautiful lies. Dr. Conti shot me a warning look. Hale's casual expertise suggested he knew far more about our discovery than any casual inquirer should. I understand you acquired this charming ruin for 20 cents, Hale continued, his tone conversational. Quite a bargain, though I suspect you're beginning to realize the complexities that come with such fortunate accidents. What do you want, Mr. Hale? To help you navigate those complexities, naturally. He pulled out a leather portfolio and extracted several documents. I represent private collectors who specialize in preserving important artworks that might otherwise be lost to bureaucratic neglect or political instability. I finally looked up from my work. You mean you steal art and sell it to rich people who don't care about its cultural significance? Steal is such an ugly word. Hale's smile never wavered. I prefer to think of myself as a facilitator. I help important works find their way to people who have the resources and passion to care for them properly, like the Nazis did. That was 75 years ago, my dear. The world has moved on. He gestured toward the frescoes. These paintings have been hidden in darkness for decades, serving no one, inspiring no one, contributing nothing to human understanding or appreciation. I can offer them a different future. Dr. Conti stepped closer to me, her voice low but audible. Marjorie, you need to be very careful here. Hale's assistants had drifted closer during our conversation, and I noticed they were photographing the exposed frescoes with professional equipment. The casual nature of their documentation suggested this wasn't their first acquisition discussion. I'm prepared to offer you €2 million for the Basilica and its contents, Hale said, as casually as if he were buying a cup of coffee. Cash transfer completed within 48 hours? No legal complications, no government interference, no questions about provenance or export permits? The answer is no. 5 million, then. I find that round numbers often clarify thinking remarkably well. The answer is still no. Hale's expression hardened slightly, though his voice remained pleasant. I hope you'll reconsider. Discoveries like this attract attention, and not all of it is as benevolent as mine. The Italian Ministry of Culture will claim ownership under patrimony laws. The Vatican will assert historical rights. Various criminal organizations will see opportunity where you see art. Are you threatening me? I'm offering you a solution to problems you haven't yet fully grasped. He handed me a business card, embossed with gold lettering. I'll be staying at the Hotel Mediterraneo for the next few days. I hope you'll think carefully about my offer. As Hale and his assistants walked back to their Mercedes, Giovanni Russo appeared from the direction of the town square. His timing was suspiciously convenient, and the way he nodded to Hale suggested this meeting wasn't accidental. Signora Wells, Russo called out as Hale's car disappeared around the corner. I need to speak with you about the auction. What about it? The sale was legal. Legal, yes, but perhaps not entirely fair. He produced a folder of documents from his briefcase. I have been reviewing the auction records, and I believe there may have been irregularities in the proceedings. Dr. Conti moved to stand beside me. What kind of irregularities? The property was not properly advertised. The minimum bid was set too low. Several interested parties were not notified of the sale date. Rousseau's voice carried the oily confidence of someone who'd found a legal loophole. I believe a court would find grounds to invalidate the transaction. You want me to sell it back to you. I want to rectify an unfortunate mistake. I'm prepared to offer you 1,000 euros for your trouble, and we can pretend this entire episode never occurred. I looked at Rousseau's sweating face, at the folder of documents that probably contained more threats than legal precedents, at the mud on his expensive shoes that suggested he'd been waiting in the rain for Hale to finish his pitch. The answer is no. Signora Wells, please consider. I said no. I walked back toward the Basilica entrance. The sale was legal. The property is mine. And if you set foot on it again without permission, I'll call the Carabinieri. Behind me, I heard Rousseau and Dr. Conti arguing in rapid Italian. When she caught up with me inside the Basilica, her expression was grim. They're coordinating, she said. Hale and Rousseau, this isn't coincidence. I figured that much. I looked at the frescoes we'd uncovered, at the wall sections that still hid their secrets, at the ancient stones that had weathered so many storms. The question is what we do now. We could contact the authorities, report the discovery officially, put it under government protection, and lose any chance of learning the truth about my father's involvement. Dr. Conti was quiet for a long moment. There is another option, she said finally. We could break through that wall tonight, document whatever we find before anyone else arrives to complicate matters further. I thought about Nino's warnings, about protocols and permissions and the weight of inherited secrets. But I also thought about Victor Hale's casual arrogance, about Giovanni Rousseau's transparent greed, about my father's name written in wartime records he'd never shared with his daughter. Tonight, I agreed. Before anyone else decides what my 20 cents should be worth. The sledgehammer felt heavier than it should have in my hands. But Dr. Conti had insisted we needed to work quickly once we started breaking through the wall. We'd waited until after midnight, when the town had settled into sleep and the only sounds were rain pattering on broken stones and the distant hum of the Mediterranean. 3 stones, she said, marking the section with chalk. Remove these 3, and we should have enough space to see what lies beyond. I raised the hammer, then hesitated. Nino is going to be furious. Nino will understand, eventually. Dr. Conti positioned her flashlight to illuminate the target area. But if we don't move now, we may lose any chance of discovering the truth. Hale doesn't strike me as someone who accepts rejection gracefully. The first blow sent shockwaves up my arms and chips of mortar flying into the darkness. The sound echoed through the basilica like gunshots, but the stone held firm. It took 6 more strikes before the first block loosened enough to remove my hand. Behind it lay darkness that seemed to swallow our flashlight beams. There's definitely a chamber back there, Dr. Conti said, directing her light through the opening. I can see worked stone, possibly frescoed walls. The second stone came out more easily, and the third practically fell into my hands once the surrounding mortar crumbled. When we'd cleared enough debris to shine our lights into the hidden space, what we saw took our breath away. A small chapel, complete with altar, walls covered in pristine frescoes, and religious artifacts that gleamed in our LED beams, like they'd been placed there yesterday instead of 75 years ago. The air that escaped from the chamber carried scents of old incense and aged wood, but also something else. The faint smell of oils and pigments that suggested paintings recently exposed to air. Madonna Santa, Dr. Conti breathed. It's a complete liturgical set. Chalices, vestments, illuminated manuscripts. She squeezed through the opening, her voice echoing strangely in the hidden space. Marjorie, these frescoes are perfect. The colors look like they were painted last week. I followed her through the gap, emerging into a room that felt like stepping backward through centuries. The frescoes covered every surface, walls, ceiling, even the floor where intricate patterns created. Pathways between symbols that seemed to move in the shifting light, but it was the alcove, behind the altar that made my legs go weak, stacked. Along the walls were canvases, dozens of them, wrapped in oiled cloth and carefully supported on wooden frames. When Dr. Conti unwrapped the first one, we found ourselves staring at a painting that belonged in the Uffizi, not hidden in a smuggler's cave beneath a ruined church. Francesco di Marco, she whispered, examining the signature in the corner. But this is impossible. There are only 12 authenticated Di Marco paintings in existence, and this isn't one of them. How many paintings are here? She moved deeper into the alcove, counting carefully. 37 canvases, plus whatever's painted on these walls. Her voice carried a mixture of awe and fear. We're looking at the greatest art discovery since the Dead Sea Scrolls. I was examining the frescoes when something caught my attention, a section near the floor where the religious imagery gave way to what looked like contemporary scenes. Figures in modern dress, faces that seemed somehow familiar despite being painted in Renaissance style. Then I saw it. A face I'd known all my life, painted with loving attention to detail that could only come from personal knowledge. My father, unmistakably, portrayed as one of a group of men moving precious objects to safety, while shadows that might have been soldiers searched in the distance. "Sophia," I called, my voice barely steady. "You need to see this." She joined me near the wall, following my pointing finger to the painted scene. "That's extraordinary. Di Marco died in the late 15th century, but this section looks recent, much more recent. It's my father, Thomas Wells, the man I told you about." I touched the wall gently, tracing the outline of the painted figure. Someone added to Di Marco's original work. Someone who knew my father personally, but who and why? Before I could answer, light flooded the chamber from behind us. We spun around to find Victor Hale standing in the opening we'd created, flanked by his 2 assistants and holding a powerful flashlight that turned our hidden sanctuary into a stage set. Magnificent work, ladies. Absolutely magnificent. He stepped into the chamber with the casual confidence of someone taking possession of property he'd already purchased. "I confess I hadn't expected you to do the hard work of excavation for me, but I certainly appreciate the efficiency." "Get out," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is private property." "Ah, but that's where you're mistaken." Hale produced a legal document from his jacket pocket. "Giovanni Russo has filed an injunction claiming the auction was invalid. As of 6 hours ago, ownership of this basilica is under legal dispute." Dr. Conti stepped forward, positioning herself between Hale and the stacked paintings. "Even if that's true, these artifacts are protected under Italian cultural heritage laws. You can't simply remove them." "Remove them? My dear Dr. Conti, I wouldn't dream of it." Hale's smile was predatory. "I'm here to ensure their proper preservation. These works have been hidden in inadequate conditions for decades. They need immediate conservation attention that only specialized facilities can provide." His assistants had begun photographing everything in the chamber with systematic precision. One of them was unwrapping canvases, examining signatures and condition, making notes on a tablet computer. "The Carabinieri are on their way," I said. "Though I hadn't actually called them, I'm sure they are. And when they arrive, they'll find me documenting an important cultural discovery on behalf of the Italian Ministry of Culture." He handed me another business card, this one identifying him as a consultant to various European governments on matters of artistic heritage. "You work for the government?" "I work with many governments, my dear. It's amazing how flexible official positions become when properly lubricated with expertise and funding." He moved to examine the fresco section showing my father. "This is particularly interesting. Contemporary addition to Renaissance work, suggesting ongoing restoration efforts during the mid-20th century." Dr. Conti grabbed my arm, her grip tight enough to bruise. "We need to leave now," but as we moved toward the opening, the second assistant stepped to block our exit. He was younger than Hale, built like someone who'd spent time in military service, and his expression suggested that politeness was optional. "I think it would be better if you remained here until the authorities arrive," Hale said without looking up from the frescoes. to ensure proper chain of custody for such important discoveries. That's when I realized we weren't witnesses to theft. We were about to become scapegoats for it. Hale would document our illegal excavation, while his people systematically catalogued everything valuable enough to disappear. By morning, the most precious pieces would be gone, and we'd be left holding responsibility for vandalizing a cultural site. "Sophia," I whispered, edging toward a section of wall that looked different from the others. "Can you create a distraction?" She followed my gaze to what I'd noticed, another gap in the stonework, barely visible but definitely there. An exit the wartime smugglers had created for exactly this kind of emergency. Dr. Conti suddenly stumbled, knocking over one of the LED lights we'd brought. In the confusion of shifting shadows and her loud apologies, I slipped toward the gap and found it was just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The passage beyond was cramped and dark, but it led upward toward what felt like fresher air. Behind me, I could hear Hale's assistants trying to restore order, while Dr. Conti continued her performance of scholarly clumsiness. I emerged through a concealed opening in the Basilica's bell tower, 30 feet above the main floor and with a clear view of the black Mercedes parked outside. More importantly, I could see 2 additional cars approaching from the direction of town, vehicles that didn't look like police cars. Whatever game Victor Hale was playing, it was bigger and more dangerous than simple art theft. And somewhere in the darkness below, Dr. Conti was running out of ways to buy time before his people discovered I was gone. I pulled out my phone and dialed the only number I could think of. Nino answered on the second ring, his voice alert despite the hour. "The Basilica," I whispered. "They're here. Hale and others. Sophia is trapped inside, and they're stealing everything." "I am coming," he said simply, "and I am bringing help." Through the broken window of the bell tower, I watched more cars arrive, their headlights cutting through the rain like searchlights hunting for something precious that had suddenly gone missing. The 20-cent purchase that had seemed like romantic impulse a week ago had become something far more complex and dangerous. But as I crouched in the darkness 30 feet above a treasure chamber that might rewrite art history, I finally understood what my father had never been able to tell me. Some secrets were worth protecting at any cost, even if that cost was everything else you thought you owned. From my perch in the bell tower, I watched Nino approach through the rain with 6 other men, moving with the quiet purpose of people who understood the weight of inherited oaths. They carried tools that looked more like weapons in the shifting shadows, crowbars, heavy flashlights, and the kind of determination that comes from protecting something sacred. Below me, Hale's operation had expanded. More vehicles had arrived and figures moved between them with military efficiency. Whatever he'd planned, it was bigger than simple theft. This was systematic looting, disguised as official preservation. I made my way down through passages that my father had helped create, following routes carved by Roman engineers and expanded by generations of smugglers. The stone walls pressed close around me, but somehow the darkness felt protective rather than confining. These tunnels had hidden refugees from invaders, treasures from thieves, and secrets from those who would exploit them. When I emerged through a concealed entrance near the altar, I found Dr. Conti pressed against the wall while one of Hale's assistants documented the frescoes showing my father. The scene had a horrible intimacy, strangers cataloguing my family's hidden history like inventory items. "The painting technique is clearly different," the assistant was saying into a recording device. "Contemporary addition to Renaissance work, probably completed between 1943 and 1945. Subject appears to be documentation of wartime preservation efforts." "Marjorie?" Sophia's voice was barely a whisper, but relief flooded her expression when she saw me. I pressed my finger to my lips and pointed toward another concealed opening. The passages connected throughout the basilica like arteries in a living body, and I'd learned enough of their layout to navigate without light. We slipped away while Hale continued his systematic robbery, emerging this time in the chamber where the greatest treasures lay hidden. But now, with proper lighting and time to examine everything carefully, I saw what we'd missed in our rushed midnight exploration. The complete fresco cycle wasn't just Francesco di Marco's masterpiece. It was his testament, his final work in coding. Everything he'd learned about art, faith, and the dangerous intersection between beauty and power. The walls told stories within stories. Religious imagery concealing maps, portraits hiding political commentary, beauty masking rebellion, and woven throughout it all were the contemporary additions. My father's work, painted with the same pigments and techniques Di Marco had used, creating seamless continuity between Renaissance masterpiece and wartime documentation. He'd been more than a soldier helping hide art. He'd been a restorer, an artist himself, completing a work that had waited centuries for the right hands to finish it. "My God," Sophia breathed, examining a section where my father's brushwork was clearly visible. He didn't just help hide these paintings, he helped complete them. Look at this technique, the way he's matched Di Marco's style so perfectly, it's almost impossible to distinguish. I traced the outline of a painted figure that looked like my grandfather, a man I'd never met but whose face I recognized from family photographs. My father had painted his own father into Di Marco's masterpiece, creating a bridge between Renaissance art and personal history that transformed the entire work into something unprecedented. Not just a hidden treasure, but a living document of how art survives across centuries. The sound of footsteps in the passage behind us meant our time was running out, but I finally understood what my father had never been able to tell me. He hadn't just served in Italy during the war. He'd discovered his calling, his purpose, his connection to something larger than himself. The man who'd come home to Queens and opened a modest restoration shop had once touched masterpieces that museums would kill for. Nino appeared in the chamber entrance like a guardian angel, armed with a crowbar, his weathered face set in expressions I'd never seen before. Not just determination, but righteous anger that had been building for decades. "They have blocked the main entrance," he said quietly. "But Hale does not know about all the passages. My grandfather mapped every tunnel, every hidden door. We can move through this place like ghosts while his people stumble in darkness." The next hour became a strange game of hide-and-seek, played with priceless art as the stakes. While Hale's people systematically searched the basilica, we used the ancient passages to stay ahead of them, moving the most valuable pieces to hiding places within hiding places, chambers that even the wartime smugglers hadn't known about, spaces carved by Roman engineers who'd understood that some treasures needed protection that outlasted empires. Sophia proved surprisingly adept at guerrilla preservation, her academic training translating into practical knowledge about how to protect paintings from damage during transport. Together, we created a network of hidden caches throughout the underground system, ensuring that even if Hale found some of the art, the most important pieces would remain safe. "The authorities are coming," one of Nino's companions reported. "Real authorities this time. Carabinieri art theft unit from Rome. Someone made calls, pulled strings." Through gaps in the ancient stonework, I watched Hale's operation shift from confident looting to hasty retreat. Whatever official credentials he'd claimed, they apparently weren't strong enough to withstand serious scrutiny from specialized investigators who actually understood art crime. But before his people fled, Hale himself appeared in the main chamber, one last time, moving with the quick efficiency of someone cutting losses. He was after one specific piece, the central panel of Di Marco's masterpiece, the section that showed religious figures transformed into symbols of resistance, beauty defying power, art surviving, despite those who would destroy or exploit it. "That panel doesn't leave this building," I told Nino, emerging from the shadows to confront Hale directly. "Ms. Wells, I wondered when you'd surface." His composure was cracking, revealing something harder and more desperate underneath the cultivated charm. "You've caused considerable inconvenience tonight." "Good. I hope it was expensive inconvenience." The sound of sirens growing closer made Hale's decision for him. Rather than risk arrest trying to remove the panel, he did something worse. He produced a knife and moved toward the fresco with clear intent to cut away what he couldn't steal whole. That's when Nino stepped between him and the wall, crowbar raised, backed by 5 other men who'd inherited the same protective instincts from grandfathers who died defending these treasures. "You will not damage what we have protected for 75 years, Nino said simply. "Not while we live." Hale looked at the faces surrounding him, not just angry, but resolved in ways that money couldn't buy or threats couldn't break, and finally understood that some things remained beyond his reach. The knife clattered to the floor. "This isn't over," he said, but his voice carried the hollow ring of someone who knew it was. 3 months later, I stood in the restored basilica, watching sunlight stream through new stained glass windows onto walls that now displayed 5 centuries of artistic achievement for anyone who wished to see them. The hidden chamber had become a proper gallery, climate-controlled and secure, but still connected to the main sanctuary by the ancient passages that told their own stories. The Italian government had declared the entire complex a protected cultural site. UNESCO was conducting a study for possible World Heritage designation. Art historians from around the world arrived daily to examine what the press had dubbed the greatest Renaissance discovery of the modern era. But for me, the most important moment came when they unveiled the plaque near the entrance, in memory of all who preserved beauty in dark times, including Thomas Wells, American soldier and artist, whose work completed what war had interrupted. Dr. Conti had insisted on the recognition, arguing that my father's contributions were integral to understanding the complete artistic achievement. The contemporary editions weren't intrusions on Di Marco's masterpiece. They were the final movements of a symphony that had waited centuries for completion. "Your father would be proud," Sophia said, joining me near the memorial plaque. She'd been offered positions at 3 major universities based on her work documenting the discovery, but had chosen to stay in Naples to oversee the basilica's transformation into a research center. "I think he would be surprised," I replied. He spent 40 years thinking of himself as a small-town restorer, never knowing he'd helped create something unprecedented. Nino approached from where he'd been explaining the basilica's history to a group of school children. At 78, he'd become the site's official guardian and unofficial storyteller, finally able to share secrets his family had protected for 3 generations. "The tour groups grow larger each week," he reported with satisfaction. "Yesterday, a woman came from America. She said her grandfather had served in Italy during the war, and she wanted to see where beauty survived despite everything." Through the restored windows, I could see the town beyond, livelier now, with new shops and restaurants serving the steady stream of visitors who came to witness what happened when ordinary people chose preservation over profit, legacy over wealth. The basilica had transformed me as much as I'd transformed it. The grieving woman who'd paid 20 cents for a ruin had become something I'd never expected to be. A guardian of memory, a bridge between past and present. Someone who understood that the most valuable things couldn't be bought or sold, only protected and shared. Giovanni Russo had disappeared shortly after Hale's arrest, leaving behind only legal bills and the bitter knowledge that some opportunities once lost never return. Victor Hale faced charges in 3 countries, though his lawyers were confident that money would eventually solve most of his problems. As evening approached and the last tour group departed, I walked through the basilica alone, listening to the echoes of 8 centuries of prayer and struggle and hope. The building hummed with life now, no longer a ruin, but a living testament to what humans could accomplish when they chose beauty over greed, memory over profit, Reverence over exploitation. Sometimes the smallest purchase can change everything, not through what it costs, but through what it restores in the human spirit. For 20 cents, I'd bought more than an abandoned church. I'd bought my way home to a purpose I'd never known I was seeking, and a legacy that connected me to my father, my history, and something larger than both of us. The frescoes glowed in the evening light, their colors as vivid as the day they were painted, finally free to tell their stories to anyone who paused to listen. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.